Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to come back to the housing affordability issue that has been so much in the press, in politics, and I think at the dinner table, at almost every house, everywhere I go, people are talking about this issue these days. And someone who I really respect, a CEO of the Habitat for Humanity in Toronto, recommended a post by the CEO of Habitat for Humanity in Waterloo Region that was posted just a little while ago. And so I want to introduce you tonight to Philip Mills. He is, as I mentioned, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity in Waterloo. He's a skilled leader with executive leadership experience in a range of disciplines, from community development to healthcare to housing. He brings a wealth of perspectives to his work. He has served on multiple boards, both locally and nationally, providing strategic leadership on governance, corporate culture, and fiscal responsibility. And as I mentioned, he's written a very profound, provocative, and I think timely post on housing recently. So, Philip, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me, we've been hearing a lot about affordable housing and housing in general. What's your take on our issue today, and what was your post and your article all about?
I think there's kind of two thoughts in the article. The biggest one, I think, being that those of us within the community who need affordable housing has grown, and it's grown to the type of population that a lot of us may never have considered ever needing something like affordable housing. I think often when people use the term affordable housing, it conjures visions of folks who are street involved or deep levels of subsidy for rentals. What we don't start to think about are folks who are professionals. We don't think about, your average family or, folks making average incomes. But the cost of housing right now, those folks can't afford rent and they can't afford ownership. And so I think we've got this oddity in this new reality within housing in Canada, specifically within, Ontario and where I work in Waterloo Region, where not only do we continue to have all of the needs and complexities around folks who have complex housing needs, we've just added on to that an entire new group of folks who used to be able to get into home ownership and used to be able to rent comfortably, who are now struggling to do both.
Now, we've heard lots about, the housing prices in Toronto. I thought Waterloo was cheaper. Are you saying you've got a housing problem too?
Surprisingly, it does extend past the borders of the GTA into little places like Kitchener-Waterloo Region. Yeah, it's everywhere. And I think that's one of the things that makes this such a big issue, is that you can't really run away from it. It's not as though there are these places within, southwestern Ontario, at least, where it's still really cheap and easy to do. Housing has risen at such a rate that everybody is feeling that pinch and struggling to kind of sort out how best to approach it.
Now, when I think about Habitat for Humanity, and you're the CEO of Habitat for Humanity, I'm thinking about, Jimmy Carter, building homes, and I'm thinking about really poor people. Is that who you're serving, or are you serving people more generally than that?
So we're serving a bit of a different population and kind of traditionally have. One of the things that makes Habitat a bit different than some of the other housing providers that are working within the not-for-profit space is that Habitat has always focused on affordable ownership. And so when we're talking about the families that we partner with, it's always been families that can, in some form or fashion, afford to own with a little bit of help. And so we're not talking about folks who are, in a situation where they're really struggling to get by payment to payment. We're talking about folks that are often, underhoused, so they can perhaps afford where they're living, but you've got a family of 4 or a family of 5 in a 2-bedroom apartment, or who are never in a position where they're going to be able to secure a down payment and a mortgage for a whole bunch of complex reasons around, whether they, what they're paying in rent, or, what their income threshold looks like. But always folks who are, working and working hard, and often families. Our focus has historically been always on families. So, you think about a family of 4 and what it takes to operate a household for a family of 4, and you try to layer in, can that family ever buy a house, especially in today's market? That's really hard. But we're careful to work with families that are going to be successful in the program. So if we're talking about somebody purchasing a home from us and they are, making, barely getting by, it's going to be really hard for them to continue to operate the home, because ownership does come with some costs. So we've always kind of worked with that particular population, those folks who are, in need of a hand up to kind of get them moving along, but not at the absolute depths of affordability like you'd see.
So what are you doing? Like, how do you do that? The statistic I heard is that when I was starting out, the typical home was 3 times your annual income. Today in Toronto, it's 9.5 times your average income. And that's just the average median home, which includes condos and other things. And so, if it's 3 times what it was in my era, how can people possibly afford it? What do you do? Do you help people with the down payment? Do you help them with taxes, or you sell it to them on the cheap, or what do you do?
So with the Habitat model, what we've often done is worked on creating an affordable mortgage program. So rather than trying to alter the price or to necessarily get folks into a home that they can't afford, what we do is we create a mortgage that flows and moves with their income. So we would say, you need a minimum threshold, and we've often got income bands depending on different parts of the country, different income bands. And we'd say, look, if you're making, $60,000 or $65,000, you can afford to own a home if we work with us. And then what we'll do is we'll have a mortgage that moves with their income. So as they start to make more money, they start to pay a little bit more mortgage. What we had during COVID, when lots of folks' work was impacted, their payments started to go back down because it's relative to their income as opposed to relative to the size of the loan. So traditional mortgage, you go buy a house for $500,000 and you have a $500,000 mortgage. It is a percentage based on that, and the bank doesn't have always a lot of time or energy for the realities of your life. If you are laid off and things change, you still owe them the money.
Yeah.
Whereas with us, historically, what we've been able to do is to say, look, your income's changed. We can do something with your mortgage to make sure that it stays affordable. So rather than our mortgages being predicated on a loan amount, it's been 25% of an income. So whatever your annual income is, 25% of that goes to mortgage payment with us, because most measures would say if you're paying more than 30% of your income to housing costs, it's risen past affordable.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. Why don't banks provide such a mortgage?
It's a great question. I honestly don't know. I would imagine because it doesn't make any money is probably the simple answer. And banks, altruistic as they can be from time to time, they are there for a different purpose than necessarily a charity like us is.
Well, maybe, but assuming you're charging a market interest rate,
we are
what
not.
you're doing is delaying the amortization longer. Are you not?
So we don't charge. Historically, Habitat mortgages don't come with interest, or if there is interest-bearing portions, they're incredibly small. So what we're often looking at is no down payment and possibly a small interest-bearing portion, and then the rest of it is a non-interest-bearing loan over a period of time. And so it allows the family to really get ahead. They can grow equity. We talk about opportunities for folks who are experiencing any measure of poverty to move beyond poverty and to kind of move out of that cycle. And those cycles can exist for a lot of reasons. The opportunity to acquire wealth in the way that home ownership gives folks has been something that has really big impacts on the families that we work with. So this, if you can, instead of renting for 20 years, if you can be paying into a mortgage that helps you to grow equity in a home that you've been able to stably live in, so your kids are in the same schools, you get to build community around you, and you can build equity, that's a mechanism that can really help a family that was experiencing poverty to no longer do so, as opposed to some other sort of mechanisms where it really helps the family get by, but doesn't always give them the tools or the space to move out of a poverty situation.
Right. So if you're not charging interest, how do you make that up? Are you doing that with charitable donations or what?
So historically, what we'll do is we'll have the build costs up front. So we fundraise to build the home. So we own or we've covered all of our construction costs before we go out and then sell the home to the homeowner. And then we act as the mortgager. So we hold the mortgage and they owe us the money. And so we don't have to charge them interest because we've already paid it off. It's done and sorted on our end. And we go out and fundraise for our next project.
And so therefore you've raised the money from charitable sources to construct the home to start with.
Yes.
So, I congratulate you for what you're doing and for what Habitat for Humanity does. But is that model a solution that the provincial or federal government could actually implement and provide more widely? Sounds like it actually makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense. It is expensive. I think, home development is an expensive game. If you look at even any of the investments from any of the federal or provincial government, when they start talking about, there's a lot of money, but if you get down to kind of the brass tacks of how many dollars per door, it's not a ton. It is expensive to build housing right now, and it has been for a long time, but it's gotten even more so since COVID. Inexpensive with current interest rates to do construction loans or any of those sort of things. And so that is one of the barriers to having the amount of housing that we kind of need in the country, is that we're at a time where it's not actually good to be building housing if you're a construction corporation or a developer, and we need it more than we have needed it in a long time. So there's a lot of forces making this really unpalatable. And so you'd be asking the government to take on, billions and billions and billions of dollars to construct these homes with, the concept that it would be repaid over whatever, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe. I'm not sure that that's palatable for your average population, the general population, as far as a government incentive. So we've been trying to find and work with ways to, have scaled solutions that don't require as much government involvement or government dollars, because there is only so much to go around. And so we're trying to find market-based solutions to really do some interesting stuff with housing, because it is such a need and it is so expensive.
There was an interesting paper that you may have seen recently on a program in Atlanta where what they're doing is they're providing 1 year rent free to people that are on the street, to get them off the street and into housing. And number one, they're expecting people to get jobs and to be able to afford their accommodation a year hence. So it's not a forever kind of commitment like you are in giving a house, but it is a 1 year commitment. But they're finding, and maybe you would know this in real life or through studies, but they're finding that a lot of costs that government otherwise would have to pay for go down. Mental health issues, crime issues, food bank issues. There are a lot of other things when people are living on the streets, and there was actually a study done of what the annual cost of having someone housed on the street is when you add in emergency room visits, healthcare visits, mental health visits, and the probability, to a certain extent, that some of them participate in crime. And it was like a couple $100,000 a year.
Yes, that
would suggest it actually pays to house people for government.
Yeah, it would. There's a lot of research and a lot of advocates that would say that it would be cheaper for us to pay for housing for everybody than it is to do things within our current system, because of everything you're talking about. When you talk about, home, having a safe place to live is the starting point for a lot of things. If you think about, considering if you didn't have a safe place to live, you didn't know where you're going to kind of put your head at night, that's going to take a toll on you. I know it's stressful. You think about how stressed folks, if you've ever had anybody in your life who is concerned about a mortgage payment or concerned about rent payments, that not the lack of stability in housing creates all kinds of other ancillaries or realities within somebody's life. So the more stable you can make somebody's circumstances, the ability for them to then start to kind of address those other things. It's almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They can't get to some of the other stuff in life if they're still not, safe and secure. And so a safe and secure place allows folks the opportunity then to say, hold down a job. I've talked to advocates within our region and folks who work in homelessness more than I do, and said, like, how do you expect a person who's homeless to apply? Where do they put their address down as? Where do they put a phone number? How do they get ready for work? Like any of the sort of things of you could get a job, or you could do this, or you could do that. That stuff all assumes a whole lot of things that a home can start to provide as far as stability and as far as opportunity that can really start to help folks, turn their lives around and get into a safer, healthier space. And that doesn't work for everybody, obviously, but there is a cohort that absolutely would thrive if they simply had a safe and decent place to live.
I agree. I think it's something that we got to think about. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Philip Mills, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity in Waterloo, and delve into this issue a lot farther. What caused it, and what are we going to do about it? What can governments do? What can people do? Is there any solution? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Affordable housing is the issue, and the angle we're taking tonight is Habitat for Humanity, and we're joined by the CEO of Habitat for Humanity out of Waterloo region. This gentleman, I think he knows his stuff. He's got a BA in Recreation and Business from the University of Waterloo. He's got a Master of Public Administration from the University of Victoria. Great place to go to school in Victoria. You must have enjoyed it there. And then, he's got an incredible resume for his experiences. He started out as a youth advisor in Perth. executive director of Greenway Chaplain Community Center, an instructor at Conestoga Institute of Technology, a board member for Independent Living Canada, executive director of Independent Living Canada Centre of Waterloo, a board committee member of the House of Friendship, and for the last 2 years, and he was there for 10 years, and for the last 2 years, he's been CEO of Habitat for Humanity in the Waterloo region. You know, I got to ask you, with your incredible work experience and your educational experience, why did you decide to work in the charitable area, building houses for people?
I suppose I come by it honestly. My father was a minister. My mother was she was a manager in mental health services and did counseling and those things. And so, as a young person, we were kind of raised in a way that said we are supposed to give back to the community. That's part of who we are and what made up our kind of family ethos. And so when I started getting into work, that's the stuff that resonated and interested me, was finding ways to connect and to be involved in community, to be able to kind of go to work. I often say, if I'm going to spend this much time a day working, I really want to be sure it's something that's worth my time. I don't want to, kind of punch in and punch out. I want to make sure that I'm making a difference and feel like this is a good way to spend. I'm going to spend 40 plus hours a week, often a lot more. I want to make sure that feels worthwhile and it motivates and engages me. And the type of stuff that I've been able to do through my career has been all of that. I think what's more challenging and interesting right now than trying to sort out housing? Like, what else kind of excites you to get up and to try to tackle a big problem? We can make, changes in one of the biggest crises we're facing as a country. That sounds like a good way to spend my time.
But if you got to go out and raise the money to build a house and then sell it, and you're only talking then about one family that you've been able to help, are you making a difference?
I think so, yeah. And one of the things that we get to do, and I think this is a real benefit as it relates to, the Habitat stuff, is it is a generational type of impact. We have worked with families and we target families specifically because there's lots of great outcomes, because it's not just that somebody has a place to live, which in a lot of respects that would be enough. But the impacts to children who have stable housing, when you talk about their education levels, you talk about their future employment, you talk about all of the sort of markers of a healthy childhood. Stability in housing is a massive improvement there. We talk about families that are not having to transition around, they access less services within the community because they are in stable housing, kind of like we were talking about earlier. When they have that stable housing, their need for other social services go down. So there is a real net benefit to the broader community. And at the end of this, we're hoping that families are financially sound enough that they don't need a program like ours, and their kids won't need a program like ours because they've moved from a situation where they were experiencing some measure of poverty and they're out of that now. And so the opportunity to say we're going to help families break out of cycles that have times existed for exceptionally long periods, and we're pretty excited to be a part of that. Scale is always an issue, and we've been working really hard to try and find opportunities to address at scale how we do more housing, how we build more and faster. And we've been doing a lot of really interesting work in partnerships recently to find ways to build more houses faster to help more people.
Phil, education is a right in our system, and healthcare is a right in our system. Should housing be a right?
Yes, I think everybody needs housing. How do you, as a society, I think there is something to be said, how we treat and how we, maybe the simplest way, how do we treat those who have the least, I think says a lot about who we are. And those are these quotes to varying degrees that say the same sort of thing. Like, people have been saying that for a long time. I think it is fair to judge a society in the way we treat the most vulnerable, the way we treat those that have the least, as opposed to saying, well, isn't it great if you have a lot? Where is it bad if you have a lot? What does it mean for us as a community? What does it mean for us as a society? And so I think we can look at the way in which, housing ought to be a right. And I believe it's from a UN perspective, it is a human right. Like, we are looking at things that people deserve because people matter just because they're a person, right? This sort of idea that somebody needs to earn or deserve a home. They have earned and deserved a home because they exist. People deserve to have the opportunity to be safe and secure. And so I think as a society, us finding ways to do that, is something that we have to be a part of. We have to consider. We can't just kind of hope that it finds itself out or sorts itself, rather.
How did we get into this crisis situation?
I guess in a lot of ways, it's a slow boil. I kind of think of those ideas of, if you slow boil, you don't always feel it sort of rising. housing is one of those things that has such a lag. Like, it takes a long time to build. Building is slow. And so I'm not sure that we saw it coming as clearly as we ought to have 10, 15, 20 years ago. We weren't building enough housing. And now we're seeing, a growth within the population. We have, I know within our region is still growing and will continue to grow for a long time, but we don't have the housing infrastructure to support it. And so there is this massive imbalance of supply and demand. There are not enough homes, and there are more people needing them than ever. And so we have this real imbalance within that system. And so that imbalance then created opportunity for profit, which then created an even greater imbalance. And so we're just stuck at this tipping point where the cost for housing is so high and the need is so great that we are now in an utter crisis without a really simple way out.
CMHC says that in the Greater Toronto Area, or Southern Ontario, I think it is, we need 1.8 million extra homes over the course of the next 8 years before 2030 to just keep sort of current levels of affordability. And 3.5 million extra homes, extra and above what would have otherwise been built normally in Canada. Is there any chance of that being achieved?
We're going to have to do something pretty different. I was reading an article the other day from I was referencing the Canadian Home Builders Association that was talking how, in the second quarter of 2023, they were seeing housing, or 22% of Canadian home builders had canceled projects. So rather than us seeing record levels of building, what we're actually seeing within the industry is less building than we've seen in the past. And the only way we would get close to the targets that either the province has set or CMHC is setting out and saying we need is to see record levels of development, not lower and less and less and less, but the realities of the market. And this is what happens when you leave a right and housing, almost exclusively in the hands of a market-based solution. The market right now is saying, don't build, you can't make money. And so developers are saying, we're not going to build because that's their purpose in this. And so we need more at a time where we're actually seeing build starts being halted. So it doesn't paint a sunny picture of the future for us, to be honest. I think we are looking for things to get worse over the coming years because we don't have a real good solution yet.
But if you've got this huge demand and high pricing, why doesn't it make sense economically to meet that demand, to build?
The cost right now, so the two cost drivers, the cost of construction and the interest rates are eating away at what many developers would say was their margins and what they want to be making or expecting to making. And so they'll just hold off and wait for one or two of those things to start coming back down, because right now they're going to lose their profits in high interest rates for construction loans, or the reality. And we saw this at Habitat. I know, the cost, and this was, I think everybody, did you, during COVID, try and do anything with wood? Like the cost of wood during COVID and the cost of concrete and all those sort of things, construction costs have risen through the roof. And while some aspects of that have come back down, everything hasn't. And so you've got this elevated cost structure right now. And, it is capped out. While we are seeing families, folks, pricing at housing and family homes at some of the highest levels I've ever seen, it doesn't mean then that that's enough to actually cover all the construction costs or for folks to make money. So they are just starting to hold back and saying, we're not going to develop, we're not going to build right now because it's not financially wise.
You see, I'm not sure if I agree with you. I do think the construction costs are higher today than they've been in the past for some of the supply chain reasons that you mentioned and that were caused by COVID. But construction materials, costs, labor, et cetera, go up and down in the market with demand. And that's the way it is. Interest rates are higher today. There's just no question. But again, that typically gets passed on to the consumer, and the consumer pays. And right now, prices are so high, the consumer, that would appear, is willing to pay because prices are so high. I honestly think the problem is, and the Premier's task force said this, and some of the bills are saying this, that I think the problem is, number one, it takes too long to get approval. And during that time frame where you're waiting for approval, the interest bill is churning away. And so therefore that high interest rate that I don't think is that much of a problem, but you think is a problem. If you do it for 1 year versus 5 years, it's a whole different story. And then second of all, it's the taxation, the development fees that add, some people think 15%, if not more. It's like $150,000 in total right now in a typical home in the Greater Toronto area. I'm not sure what it is in Waterloo, but you add that into the cost. What it does is it makes it economically unattractive and takes away the profit opportunity. And so I think it is government action, primarily municipal government action, in time delays of approval and in extra costs and taxation, development fees, et cetera. And, GST on building materials contribute, et cetera, that make it uneconomic, not construction costs. Construction costs are what they are. What do you think of that?
I think it all plays together. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's one or the other. So if you layer in the idea that development charges are a lot and that you are often going to see delays in your construction, which is going to mean you're going to hold your assets and your costs and your loans longer. So, projects take longer than anticipated or would have been naturally desired. And that costs, construction costs are up, and that you have seen, a measure of flattening in the market. There is only so much money we can ask people to pay for housing before they can't. Like I think are hitting up against that ceiling where, to a certain extent, I've often, they say folks say follow the money. If developers aren't building, it means there's not money to be made, because that's kind of often the case here, is that, folks, in the same sort of way that any business operates, but that's their goal. I think we can say that there is something has shifted in the market, and we've seen a shift recently. And that's why I was, distressed to see this number coming out from the Building Association that 22% of home builders had halted projects. That to me says that something is fundamentally broken here, that in this market, folks are saying it's actually not worth it for us to keep building. And whether that is, I think it's a bit of everything. Like, you hit your nail on the head. It takes a long time to develop land. It takes a long time to build houses. There is a lot of red tape. And there are a lot of ancillary fees, like you talk about development fees and those things going on top of that. All of that makes housing, by the time it gets to the person trying to buy it, incredibly expensive. And
okay. So you've given two reasons, and your two reasons were construction costs and interest rates. And my two reasons were government regulation, red tape, and government fees and taxation, development fees primarily. So of those four reasons, if you were the Minister of Housing, what would you do?
Well, what we have seen from the provincial government is work to waive the development fees as it relates to affordable housing, which I think is a really important sort of project, where they talk through Bill 23, where affordable housing is supposed to see none of those development fees to make it cheaper to build and to make it easier to build. So I think those are some of the policy tools that we're expecting the government has been enacting, and I think are really wise. Because, like you said, that is a big chunk of this. If there was, I would imagine if the government was to say, hey, we have a lot of very cheap loans for developers and for folks who are building affordable housing and can do this, that would help a lot. But there is also at certain points, and I think this is where, we found a lot of benefit here in Waterloo region, is there is a need for everybody to just work together a lot better, because stuff is so adversarial as it relates to housing right now and as it relates to development. We've got, the government saying that, builders need to do more. We've got builders who are saying, hey, it's costing us a lot of money. We've got not-for-profits who are trying to do their best. But, like, to be frank, I don't have the internal capacities that some of the major developers within the world do. And so we've got a lot of folks trying to work on these bits and pieces, but there isn't necessarily a lot of, it's too siloed. And if we want to see a real solution, some work that we've been doing here in the Waterloo region has been on having some partnerships between developers and not-for-profits and the kind of general community and industry to create an actual solution. Because right now, if we all try and do this on our own, it's never going to happen. And so if I was looking for real solutions and I was asking the ministry for solutions, development fees is something they've already done, which I think is great. And an opportunity for cheap money so that we could go at bigger scaled projects, because that addresses some of the costing stuff around interest rates.
So Canadian Mortgage and Housing does offer cheap money if you meet certain requirements in regards to a certain percentage of the buildings being affordable, a certain percent being accessible, a certain percent being green to a criteria that they describe, and you get incredibly low interest rates with that kind of a negotiation with CMHC. Is that a good program? Does it work?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's a good. I think it should be expanded. It's a great program, and I think anything that's going to make those things cheaper is helpful. What it doesn't tend to involve, We have some great relationships and have been able to work with CMHC through sort of partnerships that we forged at our national level, but there's not a lot of ownership-based stuff there. And so we are looking at still as creating more and more affordable rentals, which is absolutely necessary. But how do you get out of rental? Where does anybody go? And without an opportunity for folks to transition from rental to something else, we have a systematic bottleneck where the person who would traditionally have moved out of rental and gone to an ownership can't. So the person who would have taken their apartment can't move into their apartment. The person who would have taken their rental. You start talking about, so where does this start to push down on the system? You start to get to folks who are in what would be a subsidized rental situation, but they're making enough money that they're paying full market rate, but we can't free up the unit because there's nowhere for that person to go, because you're now stuck with this reality of not being able to transition out of rental into ownership because of the costing that's existing there. And so you have this downward pressure on the system, meaning there's folks who are in shelters who would do well if they had the proper supports or there was housing available to them, but they can't because that spot is currently being taken by somebody who can't move to the next step because the continuum of housing just is bottlenecked and not working right now.
So this is interesting. So do you think CMHC or a program that the government subsidizes like CMHC should be available for home ownership as well as for rental? Because you're right, it is only available today for rental. And my understanding that, they thought that was the people that were more in need, people that wanted to rent, and that second of all, they were looking for the security behind the asset, the loan, right, to be a big developer that owned the building and rented out to other people, not a whole bunch of individuals. So what do you think? Is it something that should be extended to home ownership?
I think that there's opportunity to extend it to home ownership. And that's, to maybe, full transparency, that's what Habitat does, right? Our work is in affordable home ownership. We sell the homes to the folks who work with us. We make sure that it is available and that we can keep that stuff available within the community. And so what we're saying is there should be more of this, because right now, like if you think, what as I saw, the average today for a 2-bedroom apartment in Waterloo region is around $2,300 a month. If you're paying $2,300 a month and expecting to be able to save for a down payment to buy the average residential unit in Waterloo region, which is currently about $800,000, like you'll never get that down payment. And so how does that person ever stop renting? How does that person move out? And so I think that's the case, is where the idea of like a starter home, that intermediary step doesn't really exist, which is something we're working on through a partnership here in Waterloo region with a program that we're calling Build Now, with a whole bunch of different folks together to try and create affordable home ownership options at around half price.
The statistic in Mississauga, I'm not sure what it is in Waterloo, but in Mississauga, for someone, they have to save for 27 years before they have enough money for just the down payment to buy an average home if they're making the average income and they're paying the average rent. So 27 years is how long you have to wait, is the answer to your question in Mississauga. We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes with Philip Mills, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity Waterloo region. We're talking about housing affordability, this crisis that we've got, and what the solutions are. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Philip Mills. He is the CEO of Habitat for Humanity Waterloo region. We're talking about the housing affordability crisis. I got to read this paragraph I got about Philip, because I think it's really a fantastic paragraph. Philip is a unique personality with lots of paradoxes, described by those who know him as a non-status quo guy who's caring, visionary, and thrives on disruption and change. One mentor describes him as a mix of Bart Simpson and St. Francis of Assisi. As Bart Simpson, he's mischievous, rebellious, and disrespectful of authority. As St. Francis of Assisi, he's non-materialistic, cares deeply about people, and has a sincere love for the poor and those who are left out. What a great paragraph.
It's spectacular. Better than I ever could have written, from a wonderful mentor of mine, Kathy Brothers, for an article that was posted in the Waterloo Record a few weeks ago. And I read it and I thought, that is the nicest thing anybody has ever said about me. So I'm going to start using it and always attribute it to Kathy, because she is such a lovely mentor of mine.
Well, Philip Mills, congratulations. I appreciate that. You in your article, you talked about a family making $85,000 a year and how challenging it is for them to afford a house. So out of this very laudatory paragraph, we're going to go right into the math so that we see both sides of you. Okay.
Sure. And I think this is the type of thing that I think a lot of folks maybe haven't, our minds and our idea of who needs affordable housing and what affordable housing needs to look like hasn't caught up to the reality we live in. So if you think about a family making $85,000 a year, and let's say that family is paying $2,200 a month in rent, that is greater than what would be considered affordable. Affordable for a family making 85,000 is going to be $2,125 a month, because that's 30% of their income. Affordability isn't a feeling. There are some objective measures we could talk about. So, this isn't subjective. That family isn't in an affordable house. When we think about the actual reality here in the region, where average rent is $2,300, it's even less affordable. But it gets worse when you start thinking about what would be the cost for them to try and own. So if you look at, according to our, the Waterloo Region Association of Realtors, they do this great report every month, tell us what housing is costing. So, a lot of folks, when they think about starter homes, they think about townhouses and row housing and those sort of things. Average townhouse in the Waterloo Region was $665,000 or just over in the month of June. If you make your while they're paying $2,200 a month, they can save up to $41,000 down payment. Their mortgage payment left on that $665,000 purchase is going to be over $4,000 a month, or 56% of their income. It's just not doable. But if maybe they said, we're going to look to get into a condo, so at least we're getting equity and we're growing our own sort of wealth. Average condo price within the region was $470,000, meaning the family's looking at a monthly payment of over $2,800 a month, or about 40% of their income. And so when we start to look at the reality people face, like, I think, we have this idea of a prototype of who needs affordable housing, but these are
It's
not
everybody.
That's kind of it. This is not just a person who hasn't been able to, hold down a job. This is a family of two who are both working full time, who still can't afford to purchase or afford even to rent within most of our communities. And I think most of us would never imagine or think about, when I think about growing up, or I think about 10, 15 years ago, the idea that a family that had two full-time workers and couldn't afford rent, or that rent was no longer affordable and couldn't even dream of owning, would have seemed ludicrous to all of us. But it's the reality so many face today. Like, you're talking about, if you've got a family where, PSW workers, or, educational assistants in our school boards, think about service workers within our food industry, like, there are a lot of people and a lot of families who aren't going to make a lot more than $85,000 a year. And there is no affordable option for them. Rental is too high. There's no dream of getting into ownership. Like, that's the type of thing that's showing that this whole structure is really, housing has broken down in a way that is catastrophic within, I think, a lot of the spaces. And that's a lot of the region. I'm sure you can find the similar sort of information as it relates to other places where, like, I don't think we have conceptualized that person as needing affordable housing previously. All the people we always thought about needing it still do. And we've now got working professionals. We've got people with multiple people in a household with full-time jobs and still needing affordable housing. Like, that is an indictment of a housing system, if I can think of anything.
Well, Phil, my kids, have good jobs, make good salaries, and they can't afford a condominium, let alone a home. And I think it's a shame. I interviewed, you were a instructor at Conestoga College. I interviewed a professor at University of Western Ontario who said 10, 15 years ago, when he would speak to his students, they were optimistic about the future because they had a really bright future ahead of them. Today, he says, none of them think they're going to be able to afford a home. What happens to people? What happens to young people when they lose that dream of home ownership, do you think?
I think it has a real impact on the rest of our community. Like, the realities of having a place that you can stably be and that where you're going to kind of root and ground yourself. Like we talk about, think about, like, this is the neighborhood that somebody's lived in their whole life. This is a place where somebody's grown up. Like, that opportunity to ground yourself allows you to then start to civically engage. You're going to talk about places where people don't know their neighbors, won't connect with their neighbors, aren't able to, engage with their neighbors because they're not going to be there long enough, because they know that this is a rental and the price is probably going to price them out. They're going to have to move. You're talking about local businesses where folks can't go and aren't going to continue to patron because they're paying too much in rent in the first place. They can't walk down the street to the local businesses. This has, I think, broad spectrum implications to the health and vibrancy of all of our communities. If people who want to live in our community, want to engage, or would have historically wanted to stay in our community, would have engaged, would have, taken part in what makes the community fabric, wonderful, if they're saying this, like, this community isn't for me anymore, I can't live here anymore, I can't afford to be here, I think we're going to start to see, a real downturn as it relates to kind of that civic engagement, as it relates to community pride, as it relates to, healthy, vibrant, happy neighborhoods. When people know, like, this community isn't actually even for me, I can't afford it.
This is an interesting conversation because I was focusing until before I spoke with you on just getting people housing and that rental housing was okay. But you really are stressing the importance of home ownership. Why do you think home ownership is so much better than just rental?
Well, I think that for two reasons that I, think. One, home ownership comes with the stability that rental never will. The opportunity to say, this is mine, I can't be forced to leave. You can't be rent evicted from an ownership. You can't have housing prices go in such a way where, your landlord says it's actually worth it for me to leave this unit empty than it is for you to be paying what you're paying, or all those sort of things that then start to say. So if you can't feel stable and rooted, I think that has real impacts on people's mental health. It has real impacts on their finances and has real impacts on their ability to engage. And so home ownership provides that. The other side that I think home ownership does is that most of us, and we think about lots of families, their opportunity for their future, a lot of it's tied up in their housing. I don't know about you, but I know a whole lot of people whose retirement is tied up in their house, that they're going to downsize, and that is going to help them retire. That is going to help them get their family off the. If you are, somebody my age, I've got young kids. My boys are 11, 10, and 9, and 8. That is as close together as it sounds. They're 3 boys. And at someday, if they all want to go to university, like, if I own a home, I have the opportunity to say, I could draw from my mortgage. I could draw from the equity in the house to help you go into university, to help do those things. If they have a crisis comes up, if I'm renting, it's whatever debt I can access to help them. And I think the differences around the options a family has and a group of people have between ownership and rental are pretty staggering. And so I think when we have the opportunity for folks to be transitioning into ownership, we should be trying to find ways to encourage that, because I think it does give folks, if nothing else, at the time that house transfers, that is going to be one of the biggest generational transfers of wealth that we see. And if a family's been experiencing poverty and then has a house to transition later to help that family, that helps to move families out of some of the cycles of poverty that we start to see. And so it's not just enough to be, to have a home or to be able to rent at a price that is 30%. There are other things that come with ownership that I think, we ought not overlook as a community.
I agree. However, it also leads to one of the problems we've got right now, because as people have built up this net worth, this equity in their homes, and the homes have become higher valued, and they're looking at that nest egg. The last thing a lot of people that have already gotten into the homes and built up that net egg we want is for housing prices to go down and become more affordable. So it's this this terrible situation that, yeah, I'd like to have cheaper housing for my kids and other people, but I don't want my house to be reduced in price.
It's an awful kind of, it's not quite a chicken and egg, but it's a really, there's a tension there that can't be kind of sorted. We don't have that tension as it relates to other sort of rights. And we don't have that tension as it relates to other sort of needs within the community. I don't think anybody's particularly worried. Like, if we said, like, everybody would be for, the cost of groceries coming down, and if that meant corporations made a bit less, nobody's going to be that bothered. But, like, if we say housing prices are going to start to come way down, there are a lot of people who have leveraged their houses, who have used their houses, are expecting to retire with their houses, that would be quite bothered. And so this isn't, it seems like this should be simple. It's almost like NIMBYism in some ways. We're like, yes, of course we should fix housing. And yes, there should be opportunities for that. But it's not right there. In the same way, of course, we should find ways to be affordable, but please don't make my housing price go down, because I need that. And I think there is just going to be a tension, because these are, for most people who own, the biggest asset they'll ever have in their life. And so there is a baked in sort of desire to protect that asset, which makes doing stuff around affordability a lot more complex.
I agree with you that tension exists, but actually I don't think it should exist. And let me try this on you, because the reality is, if I've got a house that is $1 million overvalued, if I ever want to sell that house and to move into something else, I'm going to have to, I can pocket that $1 million of extra value, but I'm going to have to pay it on something else that I end up buying, whether it's downsizing into a condominium as I grow older or whatnot, or sell it to give to the estate for my kids to use that money to buy homes. But if my house goes down by $1 million in value, have I really lost that $1 million? Because all of a sudden, the house that I'm going to move into is $1 million cheaper, or the amount of money that I give my kids is $1 million less, but they're going to be able to buy the same amount of housing that they would have with $1 million more. So it's one of those commodities that if everything goes up or down, if it goes up, it's fictitious. If it goes down, it's fictitious, as long as I'm trading one asset for another asset. And so I really think that people have become overly focused on the value of their homes and thinking that, no, I don't really want housing prices to go down, when they don't realize that what else goes down is every other house, every other apartment, every other condo, every other cottage that they might be moving into. And so it's almost a fiction that we're as rich as we think we are with housing values, because it's built up on paper.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong. Like the reality, like you're absolutely right. If housing prices drop by 20% across the board, then the house you're going to downsize to is 20% cheaper as well. Like there is that reality there. I guess the other reality that I think we all run into is that like we're not always all that rational. Your average
we're not.
person, you know, as much as we wish we were rational, and I can say, like in the same sort of way, like you talked about it earlier, like if we could lay out some of the math that's going to say, you know what, it would be cheaper just to house everybody. But it's not the type of thing that is necessarily palatable to everybody. When we said, what if we just gave everybody a house? It would be cheaper tax-wise. There is something in us and something that comes up when we start talking about things that are radically different and disruptive, that something inside of the broader community says no. And so I think housing prices are one of those where like, we could probably make the argument that it doesn't really have that much of a material impact on us if the prices were to come down, other than your kids could afford a house. What would people really let go, even if it is fictional, even if it's just on paper, of that perception of wealth, that perception of value, the perception of dollars that they kind of thought they had, but they now don't? I think that's hard for people to give up, or would be hard.
Well, the people that would be hurt are the speculators that have bought several different homes and leveraged up those several different condos and things like that. So that is one people. People that are just buying their house to live in it, I don't think it would actually be hurt. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with Philip Mills, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity Waterloo Region. And we're going to talk about what's the solution. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Housing affordability and the housing affordability crisis is sort of topic number one. The federal Liberal government is off talking about it this week. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, seems to be talking about it all the time. It was the number one issue in the last Toronto mayoralty by-election. It seems to be something that everyone's talking about, but no one seems to have solved it as of yet. So, Philip Mills, you live this day in and day out as CEO of Habitat for Humanity Waterloo Region. What's your solution?
It comes down to trust between the actors in the system. We need to find a way, and I think, you know, we've got some interesting models here in Waterloo Region. I referenced earlier this thing we have called Build Now Waterloo Region, where we've got partnerships between, you know, not-for-profits, for-profit developers. We are working with the cities. We're working with local businesses to find a holistic and a large, big tent solution to bring the cost of housing all the way down by taking out all the cost drivers we were talking about earlier. But that only happens when everybody is doing this. What we tend to see with housing is that there are siloed attempts to try and fix this. The government throws some money here, a not-for-profit does all they can there. You know, one developer might say, hey, I'll donate a bit of money to this. What we need is these coordinated sort of attacks on this crisis. I guess in the simplest way, we need to treat it like a crisis that it is. There's not a lot of other crises that just kind of we let rage for year after year after year after year and don't mobilize action quickly. But right now, there isn't that mobilization. So I think all of that comes together through partnerships and trust. And I think if we can find ways to create partnerships and trust between not-for-profits, for-profits, and the public institutions, we can do something. But all of the people are not at the table working together, and these silos are really causing us to continue to stumble and fumble over a solution here.
So I'll give you my solution. See what you think about it. So number one, I think HST on all new home buildings should be eliminated immediately by the federal government. I think that you can't pass that on the way that you do in a lot of other businesses, and I think that if we lowered the ultimate selling price of a home and or the rental cost of a rental unit by 13%, it would be a dramatic change. Number two, what I would do is I would completely eliminate development fees, which most people think are about 15%. or more of the average home or condominium development, townhouse development, et cetera. So, that you're close to a 30% decline. The development fees are going to be a real hit to municipalities. And so therefore they've got to be replaced. And I think that the provincial government should agree to replace those development fees with money coming from the provincial government. But it should be done if only the municipality can prove that they've shortened their approval time period by 50% from what it was before. So I will replenish your development fees that I'm now not allowing you to charge, but you got to improve the supply dramatically by shortening your approval time period by 50%. And I think if you did that, you would very quickly find that developers come to the table, start developing like crazy, because I do think that developers are in the business to develop and make money, and they want to. And they're not going to make outrageous extra profits because other developers are going to come in and compete that profit away. And so developers aren't going to make extraordinary profits. What they're going to do is they're going to build more and more and more stuff. But what you're going to do is you're going to find that the shorter time period, even with higher interest rates, means that the projects are a lot more affordable, and you get rid of the HST, you get rid of the development fees, and you've got almost a 30% decline in your cost structure. What do you think of that?
I think it's fantastic. If we're talking about lower costs and faster abilities to build, like that is absolutely going to help. That's absolutely going to make an impact across the board. So yes, HST costs are always something that we're, having that, the industry has to deal with. And so seeing lower costs there, seeing lower costs on development fees, and seeing expedited, work that we are not, waiting or kind of trapped in these cycles of development, all of that would absolutely help and would make a noticeable impact on the amount of housing we're seeing produced.
Well, that's our show for tonight. Philip Mills, CEO of Habitat for Humanity Waterloo Region. Really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for the invite. It was lovely to chat.
That's our show, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, even from Waterloo. And all my podcasts and videos are available on my website, briancrombie.com. I got videos on YouTube and I got podcasts on SoundCloud. Good night, everybody.